Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining me once again today, and welcome back to Dominions 5. We are finally, after, I don't know, 3 months or something, 2 months, something like that, doing another basic nation analysis. If you'll recall, way back in the day, I said I was gonna try to do one of these for every single Dominions nation. I'm not sure that's gonna happen before Dominion 6 comes out, but we're gonna keep trying it. In any case, this video was actually requested by Petavas, so give him a round of applause, and let's dive right in to early age Sitis, Lizard Kings. Sitis is an interesting nation. They have actually, some of their units are just straight up indies, but they're really, really good indies. Sitis has a variety of lizard units, including the shamans and lizard warriors that you get in swamps sometimes, that spawn as indies. And they're really solid, but in general, the thing that you see with Sitis is they're lizard people, they're all cold-blooded, they need heat to function effectively because since they are cold-blooded in cold provinces, they get extra encumbrance, and their base encumbrance is already relatively high. Most Sitisian units have encumbrance of 5 or 6, only the runners having low encumbrance, and the slave warriors are still 4 even. Everything else is higher than that. Most of their infantry is fairly mediocre, but the slave warriors, elite warriors, and falchineers are notably pretty decent, and they also have access to size 4 tramplers, chariots, with pretty high protection, total protection of 17 due to high natural protection, so those can be very useful. In terms of their mage line, Sitis is very kind of monomaniacal. Mainly they've got death. After death, they have nature. They then have some astral and a little bit of water. The little bit of water is actually key to the way the nation functions, though, due entirely to the spell Foul Vapors. But we'll get to that a little bit later. Sorrowmancers are their main mage. In any case, let's go through this in order. Let's go back to the beginning and kind of start in order. You've got the Taskmaster. The Taskmaster is a Taskmaster. Who would have thought? So he gives bonus morale to slaves, which slave warriors and elite warriors are. A basic 60 leadership commander, so not a great commander. A basic 80 leadership commander, much better. Formations and etc. Sitis has powerful priests, and they have a lot of different priest options. So you've got the Hierodules, who are priest level 1s, and very, very cheap. 30 gold, 1 recruitment point, so you can spam these girls. You have the High Priests of Sitis, who are 80 gold, and priest level 2, but they have another very interesting quality, which is that they are a temple trainer. They can train sacred units in their temples, 1 priest per temple at a time, so you can't spam these sacred units, but you can get a steady flow of them. You have shamans. Shamans are actually really good mages. They're efficient researchers, 90 gold, sacred for 9 research points, astral 1, nature 1, fantastic communion slaves, in fact, fantastic communion masters as well. Shamans are just really, really good. Reborn are relatively efficient. 105 gold for a death 2 9 research mage. That's better than a poke in the eye with a sharp stick. That said, I don't think you'll be recruiting too many Reborn when you play Sitis, because your other options are better. Reborn are fine, and having some death 2s around is never a bad thing, but you've got a cheaper mage who's a great communion mage, and then you've got the Sorrowmancers, and Sorrowmancers are just way better than the Reborns. So much better it's not even funny. Sorrowmancers cost only 210 gold for 5 paths, which is pretty damn efficient. They are slow to recruit, so you can't mass tons and tons and tons of them, but their paths are also very strong. Death 3, Nature 1, and then a random, Water, Astral, Death, Nature. The important point here is that all of these are really useful. If you get an extra Death, then you have a Death 4 mage, who is extremely powerful. If you get an extra nature, then you have nature 2, which pushes you up to the point where you can do some cool things with your nature magic. If you get astral, of course, you're a communion master, and you can communion up to cast very high-level death spells, or high-level nature spells. And if you get water, you can potentially end up casting Foul Vapors. After the Sorrowmancer, you have the Lizard Heir. Lizard Heir is a priest 180 leadership dude on a chariot. I don't think there's a whole lot of reason to have this guy. He's just a chariot commander. He does have very high map move. So if you're going for like a really fast reaction force of chariots, having a Lizard Heir to lead it might not be the worst thing, but they are expensive for what they do, so take it with a grain of salt. And then you have the Lizard Kings. Lizard Kings are a holy 3. They are slow to recruit, but they're Holy 3, and having recruitable Holy 3s is definitely a plus for any nation. They are capital only, of course, but that's not too big of a problem, to be honest, since your Sauromancers and all of your other important things can be recruited anywhere. So, mage lineup, the winner here is definitely the Sauromancers. Sauromancers are very potent both individually and in large groups. Shamans are excellent support mages that you'll be spamming out a lot playing as Sitis, and then Reborn are also there. However, High Priests of Sitis are also valuable and worth a mention. You'll pretty much want like one of these in all of your temples at least, just because they generate free units for you, and the units aren't actually too bad. We'll talk about those a little bit later when we're talking about national summons. In terms of recruitable troops, you have Militia, who are Militia. You have Heavy Infantry, who have Encumbrance 7, and that's really their biggest negative point. Beyond that, they're not super exceptional, and in fact, for early age troops, Heavy Infantry are quite heavily armored. I mean, they have Prot 16, which is unusual in the early era. It's because they have natural protection of 5, and this is a really common feature of all of Sitis' units. Pretty much all of Sitis' units have some natural protection, so even the ones who, for example, don't wear helmets still have a little bit of head prot, which is really nice in the era of shortbows and slingers. That said, I wouldn't use heavy infantry all that much just because the high encumbrance, relatively high resource cost, I don't think you really need them. You have better options. City Guard are a slightly cheaper version. These are basically indie light infantry, but slightly better protected and cold-blooded. They do, however, and this might be useful, they do have a castle defense bonus. So they count as 1 full point each when defending castles. So if you're worried about a fort being besieged, you could do worse than pack it full of City Guard. You have light infantry, who have javelins that are independent light infantry, except with even less armor. And then you get into the Predator Lizards. The Slave Warrior is essentially a barbarian, but with 2 attacks. Slave Warriors are really, really good. They cost a little bit more gold than average, and they tend to die because their defense skill is relatively low and their prot is very low. But they do have higher than average hit points, and as I said, they have really high attack density, and the attacks are pretty quality. The Trident attack is very quality. 20 Pierce is a fantastic attack. The Bite, it's also there. It can do some damage if necessary. They have Swamp Survival, they can swim. All of Sitis' troops can also swim, so they can cross rivers with no trouble even in heat. And they are poison resistant. That also becomes important later on, we'll talk about that. Runners, I don't think I've ever really seen recruited much. They're fast, and they do have 2 attacks, but their attacks are less high quality than the other Predator Lizards, and they cost just as much, so I don't know about that. These 2 units are probably the stars of the show when it comes to Sitisian troops. First you have Falchineers. Falchineers are a little bit resource and recruitment point intensive. They have 2 fairly high damage slashing attacks, as well as decent protection, including a helmet. So Falchineers, I think, can be solid. I don't think you want to spam a ton of them, necessarily, but in terms of damage dealing capacity, they're right up there with the Predator Lizards. They do have Encumbrance 6, which you have to watch out for. And then you have the Elite Warriors, which are just regular Predator Lizards, but with slightly higher attack values, and wearing a shirt. So they have some prot. Their head prot is still low. They still suffer from the problem, where they can be shot in the head and die instantly. But they have some body prop, so they can fight a little bit longer in the front line. And they only cost 2 more gold. So overall, they're more gold than resources or recruitment points. This can be valuable, depending on what skills you take. And they have an extra point of morale, an extra point of attack skill. I really don't see anything not to like about them. Elite Warriors, I think, are probably Sitis' best infantry troop. Sitis does have a Sacred, but it doesn't matter. Serpent Dancers are your Sacred. They are infantry. They have basically infantry stats. They have low protection. They only have 1 attack. It is magical and it does have poison, so there's that. But, I mean, most things that you want magical attacks to hit are ethereal. In the early age, if you're worried about specifically being attacked by a bunch of ethereal units, you're worried about Theridos, and poison doesn't work on Theridos. Plus, your Serpent Dancers will die to ghosts, because they only have Prot 5. Even though their magic resistance is a little above average, they'll still be killed by ghosts. Or, of course, anything that's had ethereality cast on it. So, I don't think Serpent Dancers are worth shit, frankly. They cost 19 gold, which is too much for 1 middling quality attack. They cost 22 recruitment points, so they're hard to mass, and they're capital only. As Sitis, I would not even bother with a Bless. Serpent Dancers just aren't worth it. You do also have these Lizard Chariots. They're fairly comparable to early age Qinshi's Chariots. They cost, I think, the same, or no, they cost 5 less gold. They have quite decent protection, pretty decent defense skill. They're size 4 tramplers. There's nothing really not to like about them, and they are unsurroundable by 1, presumably because both this lizard and this lizard are watching out. So Lizard Chariots, honestly, in the early era, they're one of the better chariots. I mean, you've got... Who has chariots in the early era? You've got Hinnom has the Avite chariots, which are terrifying. Qinshi has the Noble chariots, and then Sitis has the Lizard chariots. And honestly, all 3 of them are pretty decent. Lizard chariots can expand well. They can fight well in a lot of contexts. They're easily counterable by, players, but, I mean, not more so than most troops. They're not quite as fast as you might want, and they do cost a lot of recruitment points. But if you have recruitment points, if you have some order scales or something, then massing up, somewhere between 8 and 12 Lizard Chariots can wipe out most indie provinces without a problem, and a few Lizard Chariots supporting an infantry expansion force can run around the back, and assassinate the commanders with no trouble at all. So, those are the units. In terms of what's valuable, as I've said, Elite Warriors, Falchineers, Lizard Chariots, Slave Warriors in terms of troops. These guys I would mostly ignore except City Guard for massing in forts. In terms of commanders, the Sorrowmancer is your bread and butter, your hero, your champion. Shamans you'll want to mass up for research and Sorrowmancer support, and then you will want some High Priests sitting around. For gems, you get 4 death and 2 nature, so quite focused, and you have a lot of death income to back up your lots of powerful death mages. Sitis should be going for death in a big way. They're one of the biggest death nations in the early era. You're easily competitive with, Fomoria and Sauromatia, any other nation with death. Ermor has death, but most of them don't have the kind of focus that you have. Like, recruitable death 4 mages are actually very rare in any era, even in the early era, and you get like 25% of your Sorrowmancers are just casually death 4 right out of the box. It's pretty great. Plus, another 10% of your Sorrowmancers get another pick out of those paths, so you can easily have like a couple of death 4 mages with Astral running around, or something crazy like that. You can do some death magic. So, let's take a moment then before we start talking about Pretender Gods to talk about national summons. And for that, we're going to swap back over to the Mod Inspector. Alright, so here we are in the Mod Inspector. Now, Sitis doesn't have any national spells except national summons. But some of their national summons are actually quite interesting. Sitis has access to the Pride of Lions spell, which summons lions. They can cast it real easily. It's a little bit odd that they have it since they are a swamp nation, but, maybe they're summoning swamp lions. In any case, Pride of Lions isn't a terrible spell. It does cost 10 gems for 10 lions, and lions die pretty quickly, but they hit quite hard. They're very comparable to the lions that Machaka can recruit. If you have a whole bunch of spare nature gems, I suppose you could summon great lions. Most of the time I wouldn't really bother, because I think you have better things as Sitis to be spending those nature gems on, but we'll knock those out for now. Sitis also, funnily enough, has the ability to summon Scorpion Men. They can cast the Contact Scorpion Man spell. They don't natively have the paths to do this, and I've talked about Contact Scorpion Man before in other nation analyses. It just comes too late in the tree for what it is. It's an interesting choice, but I don't think it's a very good one, because at Conjuration 8, if your opponent can't deal with Scorpion Men, then I don't know what they've been doing. Leaving the actual national Sitisian units. Sacred Serpents aren't exactly a summon, but let's talk about them. Sacred Serpents are the units that your High Priests train in temples. So if you have a High Priest just sitting around, you can spawn one of these guys per temple per turn, as long as your High Priest is doing that as opposed to anything else. Sacred Serpents are not bad units. They're actually fairly comparable to those lions. They have 22 hit points, they have low prot but existent, they have a high attack skill, and a Venomous Fang attack that has a high amount of poison damage. Their magic resistance and morale are both quite good, and they have a standard effect. So any unit that you put these guys into will have its morale increased by 1. On top of that, Sacred Serpents are not undisciplined. They're, as it says, they are intelligent and easy to train. So you can actually mix these guys into squads to give them that morale bonus effect. So effectively, if you're training Sacred Serpents all the time with your High Priests, which there's no real reason not to, just all of your squads are just better at not running away. On top of that, of course, if you've been training Sacred Serpents in 3 or 4 forts for 20 turns, you have 80 Sacred Serpents just sitting around. And, they provide siege strength. They're not bad units, especially once you start dropping some buffs on them. I mean, in the late game, Sacred Serpents with, like, mass regeneration and Stygian Reigns and stuff on them are not bad units. They're pretty solid, to be honest. I mean, they're nothing super special as units go, but they're free, so what do you want? I mean, the only thing you're paying to get these guys is the upkeep on a High Priest, which is not much because it's a sacred unit that costs 80 gold. So, Sacred Serpents, pretty good deal. In terms of summons, things you actually cast a spell to get, you have access to the Sacred Crocodiles at Conjuration 4. Sacred Crocodiles are undisciplined, and they are animals. However, they're goddamn huge. They're size 5 at 73 hit points. They have a bite attack that does 23 damage. They're still not great. Mainly because, well, they're size 5 and their defense skill is low. And they're undisciplined. Being undisciplined is a huge problem for them. They also have low magic resistance because they are animals. So, in the late game, they're vulnerable to a number of magical counters, like, for example, Soul Slay. Mages love Soul Slaying Sacred Crocodiles because they have low magic resistance and a ton of hit points. So the AI thinks that Soul Slay is doing like 70 damage. That said, I mean, being a unit that's guaranteed to be targeted for Soul Slay anytime there is a possibility of anything being targeted for Soul Slay is actually a niche, is something you might want to have around occasionally. They do cost 3 gems each, and you have to have a Nature 2, Water 2 mage to cast it. So realistically speaking, you can't do this until you can forge water bracelets, which come at construction 6. That pushes them a little bit further back in the repertoire. But once you get that, you can summon Sacred Crocodiles. It basically has to be a Sorrowmancer. That's random to water, and then is wearing boosters to do it. But, having a few Sacred Crocodiles around specifically to draw magic resistance negates spell attacks is not a bad idea, especially because, as Sitis, you have access to a lot of Astral, so you can cast Anti-Magic very easily, which will push their magic resistance up to 12. That's still not great, it's merely above average, but if everything else's magic resistance has also been pushed up, the Sacred Crocodile is still the easiest target, which means that instead of rolling really, really easy magic resistance checks, to kill your Sacred Crocodile in one shot, the enemy is rolling slightly difficult checks, and the Sacred Crocodile will last a lot longer. If they actually get into combat, Sacred Crocodiles aren't super impressive, but they are very tanky. If you throw down Mass Regeneration or something, Sacred Crocodiles can last for a long time in combat, just because they have decent protection and a lot of hit points to chew through, and with Regeneration, they're regenerating 8 hit points a round. You can even try to spot buff them with small communions or something, just dropping like standard regeneration on them. Difficult to do since they are undisciplined, but they're slow, so you'll have time. And if you can land a couple 3 buffs on a Sacred Crocodile, it could be a very, very tough customer for fighting small enemy armies or raiding parties. Food for thought. You can summon Monster Toads as Sitis. Monster Toads are, in my opinion, basically inferior to Sacred Crocodiles, except in one important point. Monster Toads have a Poison Cloud effect, so everything around a Monster Toad is just getting poisoned all the time. It also has Trample and is size 5, so it can do that, although realistically speaking, the Trample in the case of a Monster Toad, which has low prot and 57 hit points, is likely to just get it killed very quickly. However, there's an interesting little synergy here, which is that with the Trample, the Monster Toad is likely to charge directly into enemy units as opposed to stopping at the edge of them to fight, and so the Poison Cloud can affect more enemy troops for the time it has before it dies. However, what makes this useful for Sitis specifically is that all of Sitis's units are poison resistant. They're all lizards. They all have natively, I think it's between 3 and 7 poison resist depending on what type of unit they are. So the Monster Toads don't hurt them very much. Summoning Monster Toads, you spend 8 gems to get 3 of them. if you have 9 or 12 monster toads kind of leading the charge in your army, or even just mixed in with your infantry, you can poison quite a few enemy troops, assuming that the enemy troops you're fighting are vulnerable to poison. So this isn't something that you can use against, for example, Fomoria, who are going to spam skeletons at you, or Machaka, who are also going to spam skeletons at you. But you can use it very effectively against, for example, Ulm. Now, Ulmish troops will mulch through monster toads in a heartbeat, but in the process a bunch of them will get poisoned and probably die, so there's that. You could use it effectively against Marverni, against pretty much any human nation is fairly vulnerable to monster toads poisoning the shit out of them. Is it worth 8 gems for 3 toads? I think so, actually. It's a really easy spell for you to cast. It's not bad value for money. As usual, you can drop a couple buffs on these bad boys to make them last a lot longer. And they're really not a bad deal. You can see here, Mechlin and Xibalba, the Middle Age and Late Age versions, get the kind of wimpier version where they pay 2 gems to summon 1 at a time at Conjuration 5, whereas Early Age and Middle Age Sitis get the mass summoning version, which I think makes them more useful just because you spend fewer mage turns getting them. Your final and most powerful national summon is the Coatl. Mechlin and I think Xibalba... Nope, just Mechlin and Sitis. Mechlin can also summon these guys, and they're really impressive mages. They're Astral 3, Nature 3, Holy 2, Flyers. They're inspirational with high leadership. They have 20 poison resistance, so they're effectively poison immune. They're pretty badass. They have very high native magic resistance. You get to summon them for a whopping 40 gems, so they're not cheap. But really, they shouldn't be cheap. They should not be cheap for what they do. Mechlin, unfortunately, gets them 1 level earlier than you do, which is just exactly the kind of thing that you get impotently salty about. But they're still pretty neat. I mean, even at Conjuration 7, you should have a lot of nature gems sitting around, since as a nature power, you might be in competition for Mother Oak, especially if there's no Pangea in the game. And even if not, you've at least site-searched everything for nature. So you should have the nature income to support a few Coatls, and with their high map move of 28, flying, and their excellent paths, these guys are great firefighters to support multiple armies, either aggressively or defensively. Just very, very solid. So that's kind of the list, and Sitis does, I think, pretty well out of their national summon list. Now, you do have the problem with both Sacred Crocodiles and Monster Toads about them being undisciplined animals with low magic resistance, and I would say that's their biggest weakness. Yes, they have low defense skill, yes, they'll get cut up if they charge into a mass of human-sized infantry that have a bunch of attacks coming in at them at once, but there's ways to mitigate that are relatively easier than mitigating a magic resistance of 7. The low magic resistance pretty much guarantees these guys are going to get targeted out and sniped by any kind of MR targeting abilities, spells, etc. So you have to plan on that, and if you do plan on that, you can kind of turn it into an advantage, because these guys are going to get targeted instead of, say, your mages. Food for thought. They're basically just big piles of hit points, and then the Monster Toads also have the Poison Cloud thing, which is pretty cool. In terms of magical technique, we might as well actually stay here on the Mod Inspector. I'm going to cancel out a couple of my other tabs there because I don't need those there. Foul Vapors is a really, really important spell for Sitis in all eras, but in the early age it's a little bit less easy to do than it is in the Middle Age. Middle Age Sitis is basically built around Foul Vapors. It's Foul Vapors the nation. But early age Sitis can do this fairly easily, either through a little bit of communioning or a little bit of boosters. You can get a Sorrowmancer to cast Foul Vapors without straining yourself too much. And Foul Vapors just wipes the battlefield. Foul Vapors is just 5 armor-negating poison randomly scattered across the map until the person who cast it dies. And as Sitis, you have powerful death mages. You can spam a lot of skeletons. You can get a lot of chaff out there, a lot of defensive spells with your astral and your nature. So you can get that Sorrowmancer to last a long fucking time. And as long as he lives, your opposing weak, fleshy opponents who don't have poison resistance will be dying by inches. Whereas your troops mostly won't. Now, Against 5 armor negating poison damage, your troops will still rack up some poison, but not nearly as fast as the other guys. And if you're a little bit later on in research and you have Serpent's Blessing, or even just Poison Ward, you can spam that out a few times. Poison Ward you have to cast several times. Serpent's Blessing hits the whole battlefield. And make your troops effectively immune to poison unless they get really unlucky, while the other guys are still choking to death in your terrible gas. I mean, you just cast mustard gas on the battlefield and everybody dies. You can also cast the Poison Cloud spell fairly effectively, which does the same thing but faster in a much smaller area. The other major mid-game combat spell is, of course, Horde of Skeletons. Horde of Skeletons is just absolutely made for Sorrowmancers. Most of them are casting it for 20 fatigue, some of them are casting it for 13 fatigue and getting an extra long dead, the ones who random death for. And then, of course, you can, if you want, communion them up and burn some of your shamans in order to cast it even more. As Sitis, you can spam out skeletons like nobody's business. There aren't many other nations that can match you. Fomoria, potentially, but they're using capital-only mages to do that, and Sorrowmancers aren't even capital-only. They're slow to recruit, but you can recruit them everywhere. So, you have the kind of death power that other nations don't really have, and you can leverage it ruthlessly. It also means that you're likely to have a lot more death income than most other nations, which means you can leverage the death summons. Since you have recruitable death 4s, you can ratchet up to death 6 through boosters with no trouble whatsoever, and that gives you immediate access to some of the most powerful death spells, like, for example, Well of Misery. Well of Misery is Sitisian property. If Sitis is in the game, they should cast Well of Misery as soon as they can. What else? Wraithlords, obviously. Wraithlords pretty much are the Sitisian endgame. They can spam out Immortals like Wraithlords and Liches. You can also do Liches very, very easily. Liches are in some ways better, in some ways worse than Wraithlords. I don't know that I've talked about these guys in detail ever, but basically, Liches are better at magic in exchange for being worse at thugging than Wraithlords are. That said, I mean, they're better at magic, and in the late game, being better at magic is often what matters. If you want somebody to fight an army by himself, the Wraithlord is definitely the way to go, because he's ethereal with 22 prot, and is immortal, whereas the Lich is merely immortal, so people will waste him easily, and then he'll have to fly back home and reform. Wraithlords often don't, especially with a small amount of gear, and they summon little ghosty boys, which is pretty nice. As it is, you should not cast Burden of Time. Don't do it. It's a bad idea. It will hurt you as much as it hurts anybody else. Ignore that. Stygian Paths, however, is a great spell. You can use these guys to, you can use pretty much, like, any of your Sorrowmancers carrying a booster or two to zip around the world with Stygian Paths. And, yeah, I mean, it'll, like, hurt and kill your dudes, but for only 15 gems, being able to teleport an army across the world can definitely be worthwhile. Other things you can do. You can cast Darkness and spam skeletons underneath it. These are all classic death combat strategies. In the late game, you'll probably end up with a significant number of white mages who are former Sorrowmancers, in which case you can drop Rigor Mortis on your skeleton legions and laugh. You can, of course, spam out Long Dead Horsemen using the Pale Riders spell. Where is Pale Riders? Pale Riders. I should just pull it up here. Pale Riders is one of the most efficient unit summoning spells out there. 10 death gems, and it summons 20 cavalry with a charge attack. These guys are really, really good for the price. They could definitely use layering a couple of buffs on them just to keep them from dying so quickly, but they take enemies with them as they die, because with that light lance attack, they do some work. They do some pretty solid damage. They're getting, like, what is that, 18 piercing damage on the charge, something like that. It's not insubstantial. And of course they have all the regular undead traits, plus they just come in huge quantities. 2 for 1 on death gems is not a bad deal. So, yeah, death is definitely a powerhouse path for early age Sitis. Nature is also a powerhouse path, just because you have access to nature communions very easily. You'll have trouble casting the high-level rituals unless you have a god built for it. And I'll talk about that in a little bit probably you won't as Sitis. I wouldn't necessarily take a nature god as Sitis. You definitely don't need any nature blesses or anything. You could potentially take a god with nature if you wanted to try and compete for Mother Oak, which wouldn't be a bad call, but only if Pangaea is not in the game, because Pangaea or realistically are both more powerful nations than you are, and they'll probably snake Mother Oak before you can. But in combat, you can certainly use a lot of high-level nature spells. You can use Howl, you can use Relief, you can use Mass Regeneration, Mass Protection, all that good stuff. Syllable of Sleep is definitely one that you can throw around out of your communions, and it will just knock the enemy out. Syllable of Sleep is especially effective in conjunction with Foul Vapors, because accumulating poison doesn't wake people up when they're asleep. So, Syllable of Sleep, in case you don't know, it's a magic resistance check, it has a very large area of effect, and if the enemy fails the magic resistance check, they just fall asleep. And they stay asleep until something wakes them up. Things like taking damage wakes people up. But, as I said, accumulating poison does not wake them up until the poison actually starts hurting them. So, if you hit people with Syllable of Sleep while Foul Vapors is active, there will be a couple of rounds where they're just zonked out, accumulating poison, and not advancing towards you and not fighting your chaff, which gives it longer to work on the whole army. Other spells that can be useful for you. Serpent's Blessing, definitely. I talked about that already. It gives everybody on the battlefield, I believe it's 10 more poison resistance now, because the poison resistance of these spells got increased a short time ago. So yeah, this will make your troops just straight up immune to Foul Vapors by giving them a total of about 15 poison resistance. Mass Regeneration, Gift of Reason is something that's actually relatively not difficult for you as Sitis to cast. In order to get somebody up to Nature 4, you're going to need to forge the Moonvine Bracelet, in addition to the Thistle Mace, I believe. But the Moonvine Bracelet requires Nature Astral Crosspaths, which you have. So if you can get a Lizard Shaman or a Sorrowmancer up to Nature 3 Astral 1, you could forge Moonvine Bracelets and use that to ratchet up to Nature 4 without any trouble. You can do that, get up to Nature 3, by getting a... It's a low percentage to hit the randoms. You would have to hit a Sorrowmancer who randomed both Astral and Nature to end up being Nature 2 Astral 1, and then give him a Thistle Mace. Or you can potentially trade for boosters or something. Anyway, it's not too terribly difficult to get up to this, which then ratchets you up to Nature 4. And then you can cast Gift of Reason. You're likely to have, as I said, pretty good nature income, so you may be able to Gift of Reason some units if you get some good ones. You can, of course, cast all the astral spells, so you can enslave mind people, etc. on the battlefield, drop Will of the Fates for mass luck in late-game combat, all that good stuff. And you can also use Army of Giants to make your chaff bigger and thicker to stop people from cutting through it as quickly so that they get more poisoned over time. So, lots of good things going for early age Sitis. In terms of gods, then, looking at the options, I would say probably Sitis likes an expander. Most nations, I would say, like an expander. It's not 100% necessary for Sitis, because early age Sitis has pretty decent expanding troops. Elite warriors, for example, expand actually very well. In terms of options, then, you do have a few immobiles. A monument is never really a bad choice. It's tough, it can research, it has decent crosspaths. That said, you're not going to get a whole lot of value out of Earth on an immobile as Sitis, so, I probably wouldn't grab that. Oracle at least has national paths, so you can do some stuff with it. Not a bad decision. All of these guys I would pretty much ignore. This is the Egyptian set of Titans. The only ones that can potentially be useful, the Netter of the Moon gives you a ton of research. It has Inspiring Research +2. So it effectively, if you took Magic 3 scales, it can effectively make your capital Magic 5. And if you stack up a whole bunch of Shamans in that capital, and they're all getting +5 research over the 9 they start with, you're getting 14 research points per turn out of each of them for 90 gold, and they're sacred. That's a lot of efficiency, Is it worth designing your god around? You be the judge. You make the call. Beyond that, all the netters and netterettes are kind of meh, I would say. They all have kind of special things going for them, like the netter of the underworld here can reanimate 4 extra dudes when he casts a reanimation spell. I don't think that's worth building a god around. If it was like 20, then maybe. But 4? Nah. The Netter of Chaos is not special except that he starts with a ton of scorpions next to him in combat, which is hilarious but not very useful. The Netter of the Sun has Awe. The Netter of Crafts gets a Forge bonus. As a point here, it is almost never worth building your god around a Forge bonus. There's like 2 gods that seem to have that as their shtick, and it's not a good shtick. The Netherite of Many Names has magic power and Adept Researcher plus Inspiring Researcher. So she's like basically the Netter of the Moon, but also magically powered for 10 fewer points. For some reason, I think it's a stats difference that doesn't matter. But if you want a high astral titan who can move around in the late game and cast big spells, Netherite of Many Names ain't a terrible choice. But I would probably look down here at the expanders, because as early age Sitis, you have access to a lot of pretty good ones. You have the Golden Lion, who is decent. You have the Worm, who is very solid. You have the Myrmecolion, who is quite solid. You also have this bad boy, the Devourer of Souls. The Devourer of Souls is cheaper than pretty much any other monster. I guess he's not cheaper than the Raven of the Underworld. Or the Phoenix, but the Phoenix is very sad and doesn't count. And he has a combination of traits that make him A, a really good expander, and B, actually very useful even later in the game. You got Fear, you got high natural protection, you got tons of hit points. So that's a combination of traits that makes for a solid expander, a la the Earth Serpent. This guy can just sit in the middle of a bunch of enemies with high natural protection, plus earth magic buffs, and not die while he eats them one by one. You also have a fascinating weapon, this Devour Soul. The way Devour Soul works is, if you take damage from it, you're soul slain. Instantly. No ifs, ands, or buts, no saves, no second chances, you just go away forever. This is one of like 2 or 3 effects in the whole game that has this attached to it, this soul death thing. It's powerful. I mean, it's a hard counter to the undead, because they get hit by a magical attack, and if they take any damage whatsoever, they disappear. I think I said undead. It's a hard counter to immortals, vampire lords, liches, wraith lords. They are all undead, but the important thing is they're all immortal. It's a nice little shtick, especially because it means that nobody ever survives a hit and you have to hit them again. So it's also a great counter to, like, giant thugs, because it does 30 damage, and he has earth magic, so he can buff his damage more. So basically, if you send a super combatant against the Devourer of Souls, and he has less than 40 protection, you're really taking his life into his hands, because all this guy needs to do is score 1 point of damage, and poof, your Neefel Jarl with 60 gems worth of equipment just bit the dust completely. And the Devourer of Souls, interestingly, is not cold-blooded, although he has all of the other lizard traits: poison resistance, swimming, swamp survival, etc. So, Devourer of Souls, excellent combatant even later in the game, excellent expander, pretty solid paths. Only 1 national path, but he also has Earth, which is a great path for an expander. And he's unique. Only Sitis can take the Devourer of Souls. So if I was playing Sitis, I would take the Devourer of Souls, just because he's cool, and he's also efficient and useful. If you want a rainbow, take the Great Sauromancer usually. He starts with Death 2, so he starts with an extra path, and he only costs 80, as compared to, for example, the Crone, who is 90 points and starts with only 1 death. Great Sauromancer, quite an efficient rainbow, assuming that you want some death, which you do. And beyond that, Worm, if you want a regenerating expander who can go underwater, Worm is a solid option. If you want a nature god who is also an expander, Golden Lion is a solid option. If you want nature that's not an expander, you pretty much have to go Rainbow, or you have to pay the premium to stick it on a monument or something. You do have access to the Mother of Monsters, who Dominion summons, monsters. I don't know that the Mother of Monsters is a fantastic choice for Sitis. You do have the synergy with her Poison Cloud effect, since she has the Poison Cloud and, you know, Sitis' units are all poison resistant. We talked about that already. So there's that. You don't have any blood as Sitis, so this is a little bit of a waste, it feels like to me. These are great. I mean, these are the national paths. I think Mother of Monsters is very defensible as a choice for Sitis. I don't know that it would be my choice. As I said, my choice would almost always be the Devourer of Souls. But Mother of Monsters is definitely usable, and in the late game, Mother of Monsters has full slots except for boots, so you can kit her out and use her as a supercaster. Not a bad choice. But overall, I would tend to go Devourer of Souls. If I'm going Devourer of Souls, I'm going to keep it fairly cheap. Probably, you know, something like this. In terms of blesses, well, like I said, you don't really need a bless as Sitis. You don't have any good sacred troops. Your mages are sacred, some of them, but the Sorrowmancers, who are your main combat mage, are not. So if you do take a mage bless, it's only going to affect shamans and your priests, the Lizard Kings, the High Priests, etc. It doesn't affect the Reborn, and it doesn't affect the Sorrowmancers. Given that, I'd be tempted to take Reinvigoration as a bless. If you don't take Reinvigoration as a bless, then it might be worth kicking up to 6 to take Hard Skin, which would make this guy effectively invincible. He'd end up with a total of 26 natural protection, which is pretty beefy. But you can get a similar effect, albeit a little bit lower, just by giving him Earth 4 and having him cast Iron Skin before he goes into combat, or Stone Skin. Either will push him up above 20 prot. At that point, the only thing he's actually afraid of is a pack of barbarians. In terms of scales, you have no reason not to go to Heat 3. Heat 3 will hurt you less than it hurts anybody else. It will also help defend against other people hitting you with cold effects. As Sitis, you have to remember all of your units are cold-blooded. Fighting in cold sucks for them. If you're fighting in cold, you get increasing encumbrance penalties that rack up to, I think, like plus 6 or something. I forget what the exact numbers are, but the effect is, if you're fighting in like Cold 3 with Sitisian troops, all of them will have encumbrance numbers over 10, and they'll just fatigue out as soon as they enter combat. It's a little bit embarrassing. So do not fight in the cold if you can possibly avoid it. Definitely take Heat 3, and you want to, if possible, spread your Heat 3 aggressively. Now, you can do that mainly just by recruiting priests and building a ton of temples, which you want to do anyway, because if you build a ton of temples, you can be churning out a ton of free sacred serpents to bolster your armies, which is never a bad thing. You do, of course, want growth. Everybody wants growth. I would say Sitis also wants magic, because you have the shamans, and shamans are really, really efficient researchers under magic. I mean, you're paying 10 gold per research point, plus you're sacred, so your upkeep is halved. So as Sitis, you can build up a really, really nice battery of communion slaves that are also very efficient in terms of gold and money up front. Research slaves. So, solid stuff. You don't really need a whole lot by way of either money or resources. Like I said, the elite warriors are probably among your best units, and definitely massable. They have relatively low resource and recruitment point cost compared to their gold, so you can probably afford to leave this at 0 or maybe even sloth 1, and you could probably even go into turmoil. That would help pay for your magic scales, and, another Dominion candle or something. You definitely shouldn't go below 4 or 5 Dominion with Sitis. If you could get some luck, that would be decent, but I don't think it's important. I think as Sitis, you can probably drop to Misfortune 3 if you want to play that way. Use it to level up your other scales a little bit, or give yourself a couple more paths. I don't think you need more than this for the Devourer of Souls, but it never hurts to have more magic paths on your big Devourer of Souls-y dude. If you have something like this, you've got positive income. I would actually probably put it in order. Yeah, no, I'd put it in productivity, because Felchineers do require resources, and City Guard requires some resources if you want to recruit them. But something like this would give you a pretty solid expander, pretty decent scales, good research, which will help you hit your spell targets, which are all hovering around the 4 or 5 mark quickly. And then from there, once you hit the mid-game, you can really go to town with your mages. The other reason you don't need a ton of money is that, as I said, your Sorrowmancers are your primary combat mage. They're slow to recruit, so effectively, when you're recruiting Sorrowmancers, you're only spending 105 gold per turn on average for, 2 turns while you're recruiting the Sorrowmancers. So you're not actually spending money on your mage core very fast. I mean, effectively, you're just recruiting a reborn every turn. You're not buying hyper expensive mages, and Sorrowmancers are, for what they do, Sorrowmancers are really cheap. So that frees up a lot of money for you to build infrastructure or to recruit troops. And of course, since you're using Sorrowmancers who can spam skeletons like nobody's business, you don't even need to spend a ton of money on recruiting troops once you're past expansion. So there's my thoughts on Early Age Sitis. Early Age Sitis is definitely one of the stronger nations in the era. It's not by any means the strongest. It doesn't have any real broken, late game things going for it, but it's just kind of solid all the way through. Sitis has a strong early game. It has a strong mid game with foul vapors and hordes of skeletons. It has a strong late game with Well of Misery up and immortal undead mages crisscrossing the map, and lich lords and wraiths and etc. It's not weak anywhere. There's never a squishy part of Early Age Sitis. Its national summons are, not way out of the park exciting, but useful in their niches. Coatls are very good mages. They've got a lot of strong magic. They've got a lot of astral, a lot of death, good nature and support. They've even got some water if you need water for something, like foul vapors most famously. And they can really build up a lot of death gems pretty quickly and dump them into powerful summons. Death has, I think, some of the best troop summons in the game, as well as, of course, the immortal mages, all that good stuff. So, Sitis, solid nation, 7 out of 10. Not, like I said, one of the very tip-top in the era, but definitely strong, and definitely a lot of fun, I think. I mean, they are a communion nation, but also kind of not, because 3/4 of your Sorrowmancers don't give a shit about communions. And all of them are at least powerful death mages. So, in any case, thank you for watching. Gonna try to get back into the basic nation analyses a little bit more. I know I'm not recording a lot of Dominion's gameplay nowadays. I'll be recording more as we go along. Like I said, I've kind of been pulling back from Dominions a little bit, sort of lost the love. But we'll get back into it over time. So, thank you again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.